Hi girls, this voiceover is a notes lesson based on the notes I gave you for when we were starting the Renaissance. As always, the notes are an addition to your textbook, so make sure you read that as well. And sprinkled throughout it, you'll see there are links to different videos which you will find mostly on YouTube. So you'll just copy and paste the video and have a watch of them, because I think they complement the learning about the Renaissance. So constantly when we're learning about the Renaissance, I'll be referring many times to the fact that the art and the learning of the early Renaissance in particular was based on the art and the learning, the rediscovery of the art and the learning of ancient Greece and Rome. Sometimes we call it the age of antiquity, and it had been thousands of years previous. So before we ever start into the Renaissance, I just want to clarify what exactly and when I'm talking about when I do talk about that. The age of antiquity was also known as the ancient era, and spanned the beginning of recorded human history, about 3000 BC to approximately the mid-400s AD. Greece and Rome both became centres of great learning in the fields of art, music, architecture, religion, and early scientific studies. So that was all fine. There was this great culture, there was this great learning, until a period called the Dark Ages happened. The ancient Greek and Roman civilizations were remarkably advanced for their time. We acknowledge that. Some scholars perceive Europe as having been plunged into darkness when the Roman Empire fell in about 500 AD. The period following the fall of the Roman Empire is now known as the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages, or medieval times. This period is thought to have lasted about 1,000 years, until 1450. The end of the Dark Ages was marked with the beginning of the Renaissance in Florence in Italy. The point of talking about all of this, all of that great learning in art, music, architecture, religion and science was lost during the Dark Ages period and rediscovered by artists in the Renaissance, and hence we have the word Renaissance, which means rebirth. I have a little video down here, a YouTube video which is about Greek art and sculpture, Greek and Roman art and sculpture in fact, and you might just have a look at that now before you go on any further. So what was the Renaissance? The word Renaissance means rebirth. It means the return of something that went before, and refers to the renewal of interest in the art and culture of ancient Greece and Rome, also known as the Classical Age, also known as the Age of Antiquity. It describes a very important period in art history which spanned over 2 centuries, which was between the late 1300s and 1600 AD. During that time, Europe witnessed an astonishing revival in art, architecture, sculpture. This began and was centred in Italy. It's divided into distinctive periods: the pre-Renaissance, the otherwise known as the early Renaissance, the high Renaissance, and Mannerism. The Northern Renaissance simultaneously was a period of artistic developments in what we call the northern countries at the same time, and those northern countries were Belgium, Netherlands, Germany and England. This Khan Academy link here, the video at the bottom, is an excellent video on how to recognize Renaissance art and how it started and exactly what it is, so it's well worth having a look at. So what caused this Renaissance? What brought about this revival or rebirth of the knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome that had been lost for centuries? Several reasons, and particularly why did it happen in Italy? But we'll get on to that. So there was a hunger for discovery the court and monasteries of Europe had long been places of old manuscripts and texts, but a change in how scholars viewed them stimulated a massive reappraisal of classical works in the Renaissance. Reintroduction of classical artwork. Now we know classical artwork means the artwork of ancient Greece and Rome. As we said earlier, during the Dark Ages, many of the classical works of ancient Greece and Rome were lost or destroyed. Those that had survived were hidden in churches and monasteries and often buried in ruins and that type of thing. During the Renaissance, many of these were slowly reintroduced by Europe, by merchants and scholars, and then they became the inspiration for the Renaissance work. The printing press, of course, came along too around that time, not in the early Renaissance, but came along in the later stages of the Renaissance. The invention of the printing press, of course, in 1440 was a real game changer. Finally, books could be mass produced for far less money and time than the old handwritten books. Obviously, prior to this, all books had to be handwritten. They were very expensive. I mean, ordinary people did not have books because each one was inscribed. Like we know, we've seen the Book of Kells and that type of thing. Now, they weren't always that fancy, but ordinary people did not have books. Ordinary people could not read, for that matter. So with the invention of the printing press, the printed word and visual information could get to many more people than it had prior to this time. Ideas could be spread in a way that wasn't possible before this. Humanism. Renaissance humanism, and this is very important, a key point on the Renaissance, was a new manner of thinking and approaching the world. Artworks were more realistic now, and people were depicted in a more human-like manner. So the Renaissance artists, in general, strove to create people and work that was in a hugely natural or realistic manner. Artists were no longer considered craftsmen, but valued as an individual and supported by wealthy patrons. And that's something very important about the Renaissance. Prior to the Renaissance, the artists were considered just ordinary craftsmen, just ordinary workers. During the period of the Renaissance, they became the superstars, really. I mean, the cultured society, the rich people, patrons. Patron is somebody who pays an artist to produce work. Treated these people incredibly well. They brought them into their palaces, they brought them into their rich homes, they lived there, they built them houses, all so that the artists, the famous artists, could paint and create artwork for them specifically. So it became an occupation. It went from just a very mere lowly occupation, being an artist, to being something that's very valued and wealthy. A wealthy person, it generally was became an amazing career. Art, politics, and wealthy patrons. As the arts grew, artists needed more wealthy patrons to support them. There was much wealth in Italy due to the prosperous trade, and that answers why the Renaissance began in Italy. Italy was very advanced in comparison to some other countries in travel and trade, and there were many guilds set up in Italy, and particularly in Florence starting out. And a guild is kind of like a group or an organization. There was the Merchants Guild, there was the Textile Guild, there was the Gold Makers Guild, and all of these different groups were wealthy groups that had become wealthy off the back of travel and trade with other countries. These then began to sponsor, these groups became wealthy patrons and began to sponsor artists to create work. And then kind of competition broke out, and the Guild of Textile Merchants would want to have a piece of sculpture produced to put in a square in Florence on display to show how great they were and how great what they could afford to do. And then similarly, the Gold Makers Guild would want to do the same thing, and so on, which all added to the work that was being produced and kick-started the Renaissance in Florence. This slide highlights the main changes between medieval art, which preceded Renaissance art. There were many changes, but just in brief, one of the main things that changed was the style of architecture. The medieval emphasis in architecture, the Dark Ages, otherwise known, was on vertical buildings, which had pointed towards God and heaven. There was a very strong religious influence on medieval art. Renaissance buildings were the complete opposite, really. They were horizontal, they hugged the ground, they were long and low, relatively low speaking. And we will get to see that when we see Brunelleschi's dome. Methods of building that hadn't been used since the age of the classical antiquity were rediscovered during the period of the Renaissance and were revived and brought back into use. The sculpture of the medieval period, they made statues of saints and pretty much saints only. The statues were unrealistic and very symbolic, not in any way naturalistic or realistic looking. Renaissance sculptures studied many antique statues. When we talk about antique statues there, they're talking about those that would have survived from ancient Greece and Roman times. They studied them, drew them, and celebrated, then went on to create their own ones, which celebrated the human form for its own sake. They created human-like figures that were as natural as possible and humanistic. Painting. The gold backgrounds of medieval paintings are a very distinctive feature. You'll see that in some of the pre-Renaissance paintings that we're going to go on to look at very shortly in Cimabue's work. The backgrounds were plain gold. They didn't want to distract from the image of the saint or religious character that they were painting. They wanted that to be the main focus. However, they did still want them to be celebrated as somebody who was very important and godlike. So that was why they put the gold in the background. They didn't just paint it grey or black or white. They used gold leaf to show the importance of whatever it is they were painting, but they didn't include backgrounds like we will see that they did start to do in the Renaissance. Also, the figures in the paintings of the pre-Renaissance or medieval period were very flat. They were lifelike. They didn't have any three-dimensional quality to. They were not lifelike, I should say. They did not have a three-dimensional quality to them. They were not human or realistic or natural looking in any way. Whereas that was all about to change with the study of ancient art and what the artists of the Renaissance would learn from doing that and create their paintings themselves. So in the Khan Academy video you watched earlier on in this lesson, there was a lot of mention of Giotto, who was one of the first painters we recognize the Renaissance style in, and particularly the early Renaissance or even the pre-Renaissance style in his frescoes. It's the first artist that we're aware of where we see a real change in the Middle Ages. And Giotto was an apprentice or a student of the artist Cimabue, and that was why we mentioned Cimabue. This is really why we're talking about Cimabue at all. We won't be discussing him in great length, but it is interesting to see the influence of Cimabue on Giotto, and then how Giotto uses what he's learned to really kickstart the Renaissance. And Giotto is known as the father of the Renaissance. So again, you can see I have highlighted there as another Khan Academy video, which is excellent, and it describes this painting we see down here on the corner of the slide, which is a painting by Cimabue and is called The Madonna Enthroned. Cimabue, whose original name Venciviene di Pippo, I think, born before 1251 and died in 1302. He was a Florentine painter and a mosaic artist. And he was the last great, as far as we're concerned, he's known as the last great Italian artist of the Byzantine medieval Dark Ages period, which was dominated the early medieval painting in Italy. Among his surviving works is the Madonna enthroned with St. Francis, circa 1290 to 1295. We're not too sure of the exact time, but around that time. If you're unsure of a date when you're answering an exam question, but you have an idea of the period, then put in C dot, which stands for circa, which kind of means in or around that time. Cimabue is reported to have discovered and tutored the artist Giotto di Bondone, who became known as the father of the Renaissance. Cimabue's style provided the firm foundation upon which rested the art of Giotto in the 14th century. That's why we're talking about Cimabue. He is important for that reason. I'm sure there were plenty of other pre-Renaissance medieval artists that painted in the Byzantine style, but Cimabue is the one we're concerned about because he is the one who influenced Giotto, who kick-started the Renaissance. So we're going to talk about Giotto di Bondone, otherwise known as father of the Renaissance. Born in 1266, died in 1337. He was born and lived in the city of Florence in Italy. The period in art that he belongs to, we call it the pre-Renaissance. He was influenced by his tutor and mentor Cimabue. So just a little bit about Giotto's style. His work incorporated dramatic storytelling. His figures had correct anatomical proportions. They were natural looking figures. They had weight, they had volume, they looked like they were real. He used simple perspective to create depth. His backgrounds, however, were still harking back to the medieval style of the less realistic landscapes, and very often just plain gold, as we'd seen before. He used to create different levels with his characters. The angels, you can see in this one, are in the foreground, the Madonna in the middle ground, and the prophets and scholars are in the background. He used emotional human gestures to create a sense of drama. We saw from Cimabue's paintings there was no sense of the individual about these people. They all looked very similar. Same expressions on the faces. Giotto also used foreshortening, and we can see, and the use of light and shade and value added depth to the painting where previously they were flat. We see that particularly, I think, on the drapery of the Madonna's clothing. We can see the way he's used light and shade to create the folds. It really does look like her knees are extending out in front of her in a much more realistic fashion than we've seen prior to this. Giotto's influence, Giotto was ahead of his time. His realistic figures laid the foundation for Italian painting and for what we know as painting today. His direct successor was the 15th century painter Masaccio, who studied Giotto's frescoes. On this slide, we are looking at two paintings, both in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. The one on the left is painted by Cimabue, and the one on the right is painted by Giotto, his former student, but also in the Uffizi Gallery. We can see similarities. They both have the same subject matter. They're both very similar in shape. The composition is similar, but there are significant differences. And this is a question that frequently comes up in the Leaving Cert exam papers, to compare the work of Cimabue and Giotto, to describe the differences, to show your understanding of the medieval Byzantine style painting that came before the Renaissance, in order to show your understanding of the changes that were about to take place and the revolutionary changes which would change the world of art as we know it today. You can see them both here. To have a better look, I want you to, there's an excellent video here. It's a Khan Academy video, and it compares the Cimabue painting, the Madonna enthroned as we call it. As you can see, that means the Madonna sitting on the throne, with Giotto's Madonna enthroned. Please watch that video. There's a lot of extra information in it, and make note of the information that they tell you, because it's not in your notes here and it's not in the textbook that you have. So if you don't make note of it, you're not going to know, you're not going to remember it, and it is of significance. When you have the video watched, come back here and continue, pause the video now, and then watch the Khan Academy one, and then come back here and we'll describe the painting using the notes that we have here. We know that the general shape of the two paintings is almost identical. Now, both these paintings are actually side by side in the Uffizi Gallery, so if you ever get to Florence, it's great to stand in front of both and see the comparison and the contrast. Both are long and pentagon in shape, pentagon-shaped, and they have gold backgrounds. So the setting appears to be in the more divine location rather than on earth. And I said that it was a medieval tradition to paint the background gold. They like to think that, well, gold must be the color of heaven. I mean, it's got to be its opulence. It was the most precious thing they could paint it with, and that's what they did. Both the paintings are the Madonna, but she is not portrayed in the same way in both paintings. Cimabue portrays his Madonna very idealistically, with a small mouth and long fingers, making her appear more regal. This portrayal was the ideal representation of a heavenly figure at that time. It was very stylized. However, Giotto does the opposite. The Madonna appears to be quite a solid, well-built, real woman. She's more bulky in his painting. So Giotto gave her a much more realistic appearance than Cimabue. I'm sure you'll agree when you see the two of them. Another key difference between the Madonna between the Madonnas is the drapery of their clothing. In the first painting, as in Cimabue's, clothing is solely draped with lines, making her appear to be very thin and tall and flat. Now, we have to commend Cimabue. He was doing his best. He was trying with the knowledge they had at the time. And that's a major contrast to the second painting, where Giotto uses shading to emphasize the body parts. We can see the way he's used shading there, light shading around the knee to show the knee extending out towards us. The foreshortening again is coming in there, and then the darker folds in here, and the other knee is bright. So we can see that both knees are jutting out. Similarly, the woman's chest, we can see he's used shading there to show that it is not a flat area, that it is a real, he's trying to show that it's a real body of a woman underneath the clothes. This use of shading makes the Madonna appear more curvier than in the painting, where the clothes look really loose like Giotto's. Giotto's are like a flat piece of cardboard. Giotto's Madonna seems more realistic, and that's where we're going with all of this. Another major difference is the angels and the prophets in the background. In Cimabue's artwork, angels are stacked on top of each other. They're like cardboard cutouts, and they all look the same, all the same expression on the face. In Giotto's, the angels and prophets are all located on either side of the throne and are all looking at the Madonna and the Child. They're not looking out at us, they're not looking anywhere except at the Madonna and Child, because they're the most important things in this painting. The angels and prophets are all located on either side of the throne and are looking at the Madonna and Child. The location of the people creates a clear viewpoint at Christ. So what they mean there is, very quickly when you glance around Giotto's painting, it's very obvious where everybody's looking, all the angels, even the angels and the prophets. The prophets are the guys who were standing, the two angels kneeling at the front. Everybody's looking at the Christ child because he's the important character in this painting. He's the focus point, or the focal point, and so our eyes are drawn to him. We're in no doubt who's the most important here. That isn't happening in Cimabue's painting. He kind of, the little Christ child there sort of gets lost amongst all these flat angels and the flat Madonna. Where am I? The location of the people creates a clear viewpoint at Christ, unlike Cimabue's, where the angels looking all over the place and have an ideal face which creates multiple viewpoints for the audience. So it is more confusing to look at. We're kind of going, okay, well, what's the main thing here? What are we all supposed to be looking at here? Whereas in Giotto's, it's perfectly obvious. This slide is showing you a close-up of Giotto's Madonna and Cimabue's Madonna. Both are very large paintings, nearly 2 meters tall, and are both presently in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. If you ever go to see them, they're just quite amazing. They are both painted in tempera paint and gold, and they are painted on what we call, as artists refer to as panel, and that's basically wooden panel. And in this case, it's white poplar wood, as was common, was used in Italy. I'd like you to look at this video link here. It's a Khan Academy video, and it very clearly explains the technique of painting with tempera paint. It explains what it is. It shows you in great detail how these paintings were created, and it will be essential for answering any question on the technique of painting tempera on wood. So have a good look at it because it's really good.